Huge thanks to our sponsors for making ResolveCon 24 possible. Motion VFX makes the best plugins for DaVinci Resolve. They have plugins to quickly add beautiful graphics to any kind of project you're working on, and they're compatible with both Mac and Windows. And right now you can get their mHello 3D for free. This is a pack of super useful 3D shapes that you can add to any video and take your visuals up a notch. Just click right here or the link in the description. And of course, ResolveCon would not be possible without Blackmagic Design. They just came out with the full release of DaVinci Resolve 19. For editing, color, effects, and audio, it's pretty much everything you need to make any kind of project in DaVinci Resolve. You can download DaVinci Resolve 19 right here or in the link in the description.
To give this discussion some context, I'm just going to talk briefly about where these looks came from and why they're popular. Because understanding the components that make a look, that arms us with the information that we need to recreate that look. So I'm going to pick out some important moments in the world of optics. Please, everyone, forgive me if I generalize for the sake of expediency. So let's begin. Those vintage looks that we're after, they mostly come from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. At the time, the two most popular processes for capturing movies was spherical 35mm and anamorphic 35mm. Here's a fun contrast. We've got Singing in the Rain and The Godfather on the same slide. So the question was, what do they share in common? Well, they are 20 years apart, but both of these films were shot with Bausch and Lomb lenses. Singing in the Rain was shot with the original Baltar lenses, The Godfather with the Super Baltar lenses. So the next version, they have the same DNA though. Making lenses without computers is really hard, and as a result these lenses have imperfections. It could be softness, swirly bokeh, focus fall off. They've got a definite look, but make no mistake, that look is imperfect. So I've got another quiz question for you here. What do the Robe and Star Wars have in common? Again, they're about 20 years apart, but they're both shot using Cinemascope lenses. The Robe was shot with some of the earliest that were made. Then in the 60s and 70s, Panavision took some of those early scope lenses, mind you, not the same ones that the Robe was shot with, but their descendants, and they rehoused them. They fixed some of the mechanical and optical issues, but again, at their heart, these lenses had the same DNA. So both films exhibit the same strong anamorphic characteristics. I mean, if you look at these images, look at those vertical lines in the Robe. They're bent at the edges like bananas. Well, look at the image from Star Wars as well. It's got the same barrel distortion. It's got the same focus fall off. It's a little bit better, but you can see they both have the same characteristics. So lenses of the era, they exhibited the following characteristics in varying degrees. And this session is about how you can add those things to your images. But this is weird because back then cinematographers were trying to get rid of those things. There was a desire to perfect and control the image as much as possible. So for the most part, these undesirable characteristics, they weren't artistic choices. It was just the best that they could do with the technology that they had at the time. So moving on again, we're going to jump forward in time. Between the 70s and 90s, there were these big leaps forward in optical design and manufacturing. Beforehand, if you wanted to shoot widescreen, the only way to do that was with large format processes like 65mm or with anamorphic lenses. But now film and optics had got so good by the 90s that you can finally shoot spherical on 35mm and just crop the image down to your desired aspect ratio. And that had this big plus because getting rid of all of those anamorphic imperfections was a huge help for this new thing called CGI, because it was a lot easier to composite onto a clean and consistent image. So actually, a lot of your favorite widescreen films from the 90s and early noughties are shot spherically. For example, Jurassic Park, or here's a 2.39 extracted from spherical 35mm in Independence Day. Look how clean that image is. There's no distortion. All of those vertical lines are straight. And here's just one more example. Lord of the Rings, shot spherically. So let's jump forward again. This time set your time machine for somewhere around 2010. And image and optics, they've continued to improve, thanks in a big way to digital cameras. And as the clarity of the image improves, something interesting happens. There is a new generation of directors who don't want clean images. They want ones that more closely resemble their memories of cinema. They want images that evoke nostalgia images that remind people that they're watching a movie. So we hit this inflection point where the quest for clean became the quest for character. So this is Star Trek from 2009. By the late noughties, Panavision had made the E, G, and T series anamorphic lenses. And JJ comes along and he says, nah, let's shoot with the C series from the 60s. Inception used the same lens. Look how bowed those vertical lines are in the extremities of the image. And as a result of this renewed interest in vintage lenses, their prices absolutely skyrocket. So one of the most popular spherical lenses, the spherical vintage lenses, is the Canon K35. Do you know now if you want to buy a set second hand, it will cost you about $250,000, which is crazy because just 15 years ago, those same lenses might have cost just $25,000. So on the one hand, making movies with vintage lenses can be very expensive. But fortunately, manufacturers have responded to the market's cries for lenses with vintage characteristics. It's kind of crazy because people are now making brand new lenses, but deliberately making them bad, sort of. So making movies with vintage lenses doesn't have to be expensive, but it is kind of still hard because those lenses do have certain challenges. So there's another approach. This brings us down to what we're going to talk about today. We're looking to another cinematic pioneer for this. We're looking at David Fincher. He's renowned for how much he loves to control details in the image that he shoots. So this image that you're looking at was shot with a Leitz Summilux Cine lens. It's expensive. And it's one of the cleanest lenses you can buy. But look, it's got barrel distortion, anamorphic flare, chromatic aberration, sharpness fall off. It looks like it's a Cinemascope lens. Well, those characteristics have been added in post. So what if you can get all the benefits of shooting with clean spherical lenses, but you can dial that vintage look in post? This is what we're going to do today. Now, I don't have Leitz Summicrons to shoot with, but I've got this. This is DaVinci Arles Primes. That's kind of DZO's answer to lenses like the Summicrons or Takeda Vista Primes, lenses like that. Why these lenses a great starting point? It's because a clean image gives us a blank canvas now to paint whatever characteristics we want onto it. So heading into Resolve, I've got a series of images shot on these lenses, and we're going to see if we can turn them into a convincing vintage lens. So I'm going to start with this shot here, which I kind of love because it's like a nice ordinary shot to start with. There isn't anything in there that screams anamorphic or vintage, and we're going to try and make this into a Cinemascope image. And the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to add that characteristic, distinctive anamorphic bokeh in the background, you know, where the highlights, the out of focus elements stretch vertically. So let's add a new node to do this, and I'm going to keep everything nice and neat and label it. And I'm not going to use like the default blur and sharpen controls here because it won't give me the right kind of blur in the image. Up in the effects browser, we've got a really cool effect called lens blur. And if I pop that on the image, you'll see one of the controls it has is anamorphism. I didn't know that was a word, but this controls the shape of the out of focus highlights. You can see they can stretch horizontally or vertically. So let's go full vertical with that. So that's now emulating the out of focus highlights of an anamorphic lens. It's blurring the entire image at the moment, right? We don't want that. We want it just to blur the background. Sometimes when I demonstrate stuff, what I'll do is I'll show you a bad way of doing it because it helps us to appreciate the good way of doing it and why we're going to do it that way. So I'm going to grab Magic Mask in object mode and let me just, there you go, draw him in. I'm going to invert that so it's blurring the background. And you'll see that the problem with this, the problem that's happening here, see this smudged halo that we have around the edge of our model here? That's because of the order in which the mask and the blur are getting applied. So DaVinci is applying the blur to the image. So that means it's blurring the foreground into the background and vice versa. And then it's cutting that shape out with the mask. We want it the other way around. Now, this was really hard to do up until version 19, when Blackmagic released the defocus background effect. So let's delete off lens blur and we'll pop in the defocus background effect. And this effect likes its mask the other way around. So let's flip that magic mask back around. But check this out. We now no longer have that smudgy halo around our character. Awesome. Let's just make it a little bit blurrier and of course make it anamorphic. Magic Mask is an amazing tool, but I don't think it's the best tool for this kind of job that we're doing, because as things get further away from the camera, I want them to get more blurred rather than just having this hard line where it's clean and crisp and now suddenly it's blurred. So let me take off the Magic Mask and I'm going to use Depth Map. Now I can't build Depth Map into my bokeh node because it's already got an OpenFX effect on it. I will create down here like a little parallel image pipeline. And let's name this up, Depth Map. And I'm going to grab the Depth Map effect and apply it to that. Now, obviously, I can't see what's going on in this node because it's not connected to my image pipeline. This is what the highlight button is for. It allows me to see just the output of the node that I have selected. And this little map here, once I feed it into that bokeh node, parts of the image that are black will be completely defocused and parts of the image that are white will be crisp. But as you can see, this depth map, everything's gray. There's no pure black and there's no pure white in there. And I don't want his head getting defocused. I want that to be sharp and crisp. So I will use the map adjustment tools. And I've kind of, I've had some experience with this shot already. So I'm just going to jump straight to values that I know work. And you can see that he is now going to be completely in focus. That brick wall to the left will be partially defocused and the background is just going to be all the way defocused. Right. Normally with depth map, you'd hit depth map preview, turn it off, and then I would be able to link the key output of this node to the key output of this key input of that node. Here's a little hot tip for you. I like to leave depth map preview turned on because it makes it easier when I need to come back and manipulate my depth map. And when it's turned on, instead of connecting the key output, I could just run the RGB output straight into the key input of the bokeh node. Let's turn off the highlight mode. I feel like I've already said bokeh, bokeh like 3 or 4 different ways. So I apologize for the shifting pronunciation. Cool, check that out. We've got a nice defocused background. He's nice and sharp in the foreground as well. Do you know what I think I'm going to do? I'm just going to add a little bit of expansion and a little bit of blur to it to help clean up some, the bits where the depth map hasn't entirely worked out what's in the foreground and what's in the background. A little blur covers over a lot of things. This is looking great. So next thing, like we've got a shopping list of characteristics we want to introduce to this image. The next thing I'm going to add is some distortion. I want that signature Cinemascope distortion. Let's make a new node, label it, head to my effects bin, and I'm going to use the lens distortion effect. And you know what's kind of cool here is I'm happy with the default settings. They look good. Not too much distortion, not too little distortion. So I'm not going to make any adjustments to that. But because it's distorted the edges of the image in, I do have a slight problem here. Because obviously I don't want this sort of retro TV shape on the image. So I need to zoom it in, crop back in on the image. I can do that in the sizing tab. By default, this opens in the input sizing tab. So in my image pipeline, if I make changes here, it's going to resize the image at this point in my pipeline. I want the resize operation to happen here, just after the distortion node. I can do that by switching to the node sizing tab. And now anything I put in here is done after the distortion. All right. Do you know what like a really important part of the Cinemascope look is? That's the aspect ratio of the image. So let's add some letterboxing to this. I'm going to head back to the edit page. I can do that if I go up to timeline, output blanking. Look, I can turn on 239 output blanking here, which is cool. But the problem with that is it applies that blanking to the entire timeline. And I often use like widescreen in a project where I've got different aspect ratios. So I want to have letterboxing in one part, but maybe not in another part. So let's turn output blanking off. I could go download a PNG or something to do this, but why do that when we've got Fusion built into DaVinci Resolve? So let's add a Fusion composition. I'm going to pop that in and make it nice and long. We can close effects down now, and let's run into the Fusion page. One moment. Sorry about that. All right, so let's head back into the Fusion page. Here we go. Here's our blank Fusion composition. We've got so many fantastic Fusion teachers on at ResolveCon, so I'm not going to labor this too much, but I'm going to make a rectangle node, a background node, connect the two of them together, connect it to my media out, and let's tweak this rectangle node. I'm going to make it the same width as the image, and now look what happens when I click invert. Ladies and gentlemen, letterboxing, black bars. But I don't want to have to sort of work out the maths here to like, I want to be accurate. I want to put a proper Cinemascope aspect ratio on this image. So let's just write a teeny expression here. I'm going to right click on the rectangle node, go to edit controls. And first up, I'm going to add a custom control and call it aspect ratio. I'm going to make it a slider, and I'm going to give it a default value of 2.39. Done. There it is. There's my new aspect ratio control. And then I want this to control the height of this rectangle. So let's open up the expression controls here. And here's an expression that I wrote earlier. Jake Tip did such a fantastic job with his lesson about Fusion expressions the other day, so I can't do any better than that. So let me just paste this expression in. And now, check this out. I can put an actual proper cinematic aspect ratio in here, and it controls those black bars. So I could just go use this Fusion composition straight away in the edit page, but I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to turn it into an effect that I can control on the edit page. So select all the nodes, right click, go to create macro. I want to select that custom aspect ratio control I made so it gets exposed in the edit page. Let's hit close. I'm going to save my macro tool into the folder where DaVinci Resolve looks for those Fusion macros. So let's go generators. I'm going to pop it in here. And now, when I head back to the edit page, I can get rid of that Fusion composition that I created because I've now got a custom Fusion generator that I've made. And when I pop it in, check this out. Look, I've got controls in here. And if I want to do that cool thing, where the cutscene starts and like the bars come in, look at this. It's an animatable property. So I could have it kind of, crimp down on the image as that cool cutscene starts playing. So we'll just reset it to 239. I'm going to extend it so it's the length of all 6 of these shots down here. That looks amazing. So back into the color page, and let's carry on with this shot here. I need to reposition him down a little bit, right? Because I didn't frame this shot initially for Cinemascope aspect ratio. So there you go, that looks good. Next thing I'd like to add is chromatic aberration. So a new node. And for this, I'm going to use the chromatic aberration removal tool. This is actually for removing chromatic aberration, but you know what? If you crank it up a little bit, you can actually get it to reintroduce chromatic aberration into the image. So let me zoom in on some of these bright highlights that are on the couch. I'm just going to ease this up a little bit, and maybe let's not go too far, but look, now you can see chromatic aberration on those highlights on the sofa. Next feature, let's add some focus fall off. So new node, you know the drill. Let's name it. And again, I'm going to use that defocus background effect for this. And yeah, let's crank that blur up a little bit. Let's make it anamorphic. I need to create a mask to control where that blur goes in the image. I'll do that with a power window. And let's make it a little bit larger, make it a little bit softer. So this is like one of the really cool things about building these looks in post, because with an actual genuine vintage lens, the focus fall off would be centered in the middle of the lens. And I've got like a 1/3 composition here, you know, where my subject's off to the side, and he'd be right in the soft part of the lens. But because I'm recreating this vintage look in post, I can just go boop and move that over and now centralize it on my subject. So I'm getting more creative control in how those vintage characteristics are expressed. There's one last thing that we're going to add, and that's a vignette, or a vignette as it's spelt. I'll make another power window, and just like with that focus fall off, my apologies, I can control where this vignette goes in the image. So again, I'm going to centralize it on our subjects over on the right hand side. Let's invert that mask and then use the gamma tool just to bring a vignette into the image. This is looking pretty good. There is actually one more thing though that I'd like to do to the image, because all this softness that we've added to the image, we don't want people to watch this image and think, ew, you know, that looks soft. Also, this softening will have softened the grain and the noise that's naturally in the image. So when you do VFX work, sometimes, you know, you clean out the grain and then you make sure you apply it again afterwards, because images don't look right unless they've got that grain on them. So yeah, all this blurring will have destroyed all of the grain in the background of the image and anywhere where our defocusing effects have touched the image. So I'm going to head into the timeline node tree and I'm going to add some grain. I could do it with the film grain effect, but actually I'm really digging using the new film look creator introduced in version 19. So let's drag that on. I'm going to use the clean slate preset so I can build it up from scratch. And I'll turn on grain. Usually, you know, I try to be temperate with grain, but because we're pushing this stream out over a really compressed signal, I'm just going to crank it up more than usual to make sure that it's visible and that everyone can see it. So there we go. There's the grain. And while I'm here, I can't resist it. Let's just put a teeny bit of a film look on this by using the Rochester film look. And there we go. Let me demo this on and off. So the original image, our fake Cinemascope image. And by the way, this clip that I'm working with is 8.6K raw footage from a Sony Burano. These effects are super processor intensive, so real-time playback would be a real challenge with this. But I've had render caching turned on the whole time, and you can see that just as quick as I've been building up this effect, these nodes have been turning blue to indicate that they're render cached. So I get completely smooth playback on this shot, which is really cool. I'm pretty pleased with that. I think that's looking pretty good. Obviously, a video has more than one shot in, so we need to be able to apply this look consistently to a collection of shots. And we don't want to turn every single shot into a major VFX job. So let's see how easily this look copies between different images. So the first image here, I feel like we're cheating because it's basically the same shot, but I'm just going to middle mouse click. So I'm clicking down on the wheel on shot 1, and you'll see that that copies the entire grade across. And there you go. As expected, I mean, that one works perfectly because it's the same shot. Let's set this grade up as a gallery still to make it easier to apply to other shots in the timeline. So Darren the other day had some really good suggestions about this. When you set up a gallery still, like a template that you're using on a lot of shots, is you want it to be set up like in its vanilla mode, so that when you pop it onto another shot, you've not got to change settings constantly. So let me move the focus fall off and the vignette back into the middle of the image. And now I'll right click on it and grab a still. So there it is in my gallery. Right, let's apply it to this shot. I've already got a color grade, a primary color grade here. So I don't want to destroy that when I apply this look. So instead of just double clicking and writing this still onto the node, I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to go append node graph. So it will add it after the primary grade that I've already got in there. And because this shot doesn't really have a background to speak of that is going to want to get removed, to get thrown out of focus, I might as well just disable the depth map and the bokeh node. And, you know, maybe this isn't the best shot for showing off strong vintage characteristics, but look, we've got the cool focus fall off at the top and the bottom. And if she was to move around the screen, actually, you'd be more aware of the distortion because you'd see her shape changing slightly as she moves from one side to the other. So that's just something to keep in mind. Let's move on to the next shot. Oh, look, it's me. So let's do the same thing. Let's append the node graph. And I mean, like, oh, I think that's worked pretty good. Like, considering that was built on a different shot. Let's turn it off. So this is before. Look, straight lines in the background, okay? And then when we turn it on, now they're all bowed as we'd expect to see in Cinemascope. And what we can do is let's just click on the depth map and hit the highlight button just to check that the depth map is capturing the foreground correctly. My goodness, my my ears do look big in silhouette. So yeah, look, brilliant. That's capturing it correctly. This is why I like leaving the depth map preview turned on, because checking it out was as simple as selecting the node and pushing highlight. That looks great. So the shots that we've dealt with thus far haven't had any strong light sources in them. So we haven't really had an opportunity to create some anamorphic lens flare. So that's what the next shot is for. This shot here. So we've got these candles. They're bright light sources, you know, when you're filming in a room that hasn't got any other lights in. So let's apply our master Cinemascope grade to this. I'm going to append the node graph. Close down the gallery now. Hey, we can even get rid of the clips preview to make even more room. First thing we need to do, so new shot, let's just check if the depth map is working properly with this shot. So I've selected the depth map node. I've hit the highlight button to turn on the depth map preview. And yeah, man, this is all wrong. Look, it's capturing way too much of the background. This is all behind our subjects, so it should be like black or dark grey because we want it to be thrown out of focus. So again, I've got the privilege of hindsight here, but from playing around with this image previously, that far and near limit I've found to work really well. Look, it's isolating him really nicely now. So we can turn that highlight mode off. I mean, man, I think that's looking really nice. Let's add some lens flare to these candles. I'm going to add it after the vignette. Now, in Resolve, there are really cool effects like lens flare. Let's apply this. And I think by default, it's giving me like a spherical lens flare. But one of these presets up here, 1970s sci-fi. which I'm pretty sure it's like in the film look creator, Rochester is kind of the Kodak thing. 1970s sci-fi, to me, that sounds like Panavision C-series lenses. And I've now got this control and I can position the lens flare where I want it. That looks pretty cool. This image is locked off, okay? So the tripod's not moving. So I don't have to worry about animating or tracking in the movement of that lens flare. But there are like 4 candles here, and you know, I won't see this all the way through, but I guess what I could do is I could add a parallel node, and you know, then I could apply a lens flare to that, and you know, grab that and move that into place, and then I could repeat that 2 or 3 more times, but that kind of gets a little bit tedious. And if we're going to apply this look consistently across a series of shots, we want to avoid that scenario where we have to do a whole bunch of manual work with every single clip that we come across. So I'm going to show you a really hacky way of getting some nice anamorphic lens flare in your images, but without going through this palaver. So let's undo the creation of that second node. There we go. We're back to 1. Let's delete that lens flare effect. And instead of lens flare, I'm going to use lens reflections. Here we go, lens reflections. And it's given us this really nice, soft, internal lens reflection, right? It's trying to simulate what happens when light bounces around inside of a lens. I've got controls here for different elements in this lens reflection simulation. So, you know, I can tweak some of these individual elements. So maybe I'll bring that brightness down, or I'll make it a little bit sharper, a lot less defocused. Let's see what's element 2 doing. It's giving us that like nice purpley haze. I like this stuff, so honestly, I'm not going to play with it. All the way down the bottom, reflecting element number 4 is not currently being used. So let's turn it on. When I increase the brightness from 0 to any value that was above 0, look, it's turned on the rest of the controls. And let's wait for it to render into the image. You can see all these nodes are still render caching in the background. Here is lens reflection element number 4. Position in optical path. This control here is kind of controlling in this virtual lens which one of the pieces of the glass in the lens is actually producing this reflection. And the more I dial this value down to 0, you'll see that that lens reflection gets closer to the source that's creating it. So all the way at 0, it's directly on top of the candle. Brilliant. I wonder what this stretch control does. Let's amp it up a little bit. There you go. Check that out. We've stretched and elongated that lens reflection, and now it kind of looks like an anamorphic flare. Let's give it a little bit of fall off. If I want that Panavision C-series vibe, look, I can turn the lens coating on to blue, run colorize up a little bit, and now I'm sort of getting that C-series anamorphic flare. The thing that I don't like with this flare at the moment, though, is because it's being generated by such a large light source, the flares, the bands are actually kind of quite thick. They're too thick. I want like a thin line. And there is a control that will help us somewhat with that. Up the top, I'm going to change the output from final composite to isolated source. And that's going to show me the portion of the image that's being used to generate these lens reflections. There it is. And you can see, look, it's including a whole bunch of the candle. I don't want it to. So open up isolation controls. I'm going to turn the gamma down. I'm going to turn the brightness down. And Like, I won't spend too long perfecting this, but you can see, look, I'm making the portion of the image that's generating those flares smaller and smaller. And now, when I go back to Final Composite, we've got finer lines on those lens flares. Now, this is really fun. I've actually got an image here, the same scene that was shot on an actual genuine anamorphic lens. It's this guy here. And I don't think like I'm too far off producing something that's convincing with just the basic tools that come in DaVinci Resolve. If anything, I think ironically, I've made my fake anamorphic shot look more anamorphic than the actual anamorphic shot. But hey, I like it. I think it's looking pretty cool. So thus far, we have focused on creating a Cinemascope vintage aesthetic. Let's do a spherical example. So I'm going to use this shot for this, and we're going to kind of follow a similar workflow to what we did with our Cinemascope demonstration. The first thing I want to do is I want some way of isolating the foreground against the background so I can add blur to the background, not to the foreground. So let's set this up. Add my defocus node here, and again, like before, I'm going to use the really cool defocus effect, and let's crank it up. I don't need to make this one anamorphic because I'm trying to do spherical lens blur. And then I'll add a corrector node down here, and this time I am going to use Magic Mask. I'm going to use Magic Mask in the person mode, and we'll draw Natalie in and connect the key output to the key input of the defocus node. And there you go, background blurred. Now, we've got an issue here. The mask isn't perfect, so popping it into better mode really helps clean this up. Look at that. That edge is a little bit too sharp for me, so we'll add some blur. And sometimes when you add blur, or when you add too much blur, or your mask's not perfect, you kind of end up with this iPhone portrait mode look, where there's this weird smudge around the edge. You know, it can't work out if that's foreground or background, and it's blurred both of them a little bit. The foreground's blurred too much, the background's not blurred enough, and you get this kind of weird halo effect. So if you ever get that, what I like to do is to shrink down the mask a little bit, and it moves that transitional blur area. Instead of being on the boundary between the foreground and the background, it moves it onto the foreground itself. And if anything, it adds to that vintage look because it just makes the lens look a little bit softer. So I want to do one of those swirly bokeh looks like we saw in the Singing in the Rain example shot. You get them with Helios lenses, you get them with Petzval lenses. So let's see if we can emulate something like that. I'm going to add a new node here. I'm going to call this radial blur, because guess what? I'm going to add the radial blur effect to it. And let's just preview what this node is doing and nothing else. I'm going to turn highlight mode on, and you can see it is doing what we asked it to. It's adding radial blur to the image. But I don't want the blur to affect the foreground. Well, I can reuse that magic mask that I created earlier and feed that into the radial blur node. And well, not unfortunately, but like by default, it's now blurring the wrong part of the image. Instead of flipping the magic mask on this node down here, I'm just going to flip the key input on the radial blur node. So I'll go to the key control and just invert the input key. And I also don't want the swirly effect to be too much in the center of the image. So I will also add a power window to this node. This often happens, right? When you add a power window or something, depending on what you're trying to do, initially it's the wrong way round. So it's actually selecting the middle. I want it to deselect the middle. All I need to do is invert it. And you can see now that we've got a combination of the magic mask, you can see that down here, and the power window that I created in the middle. Okay, let's turn off highlight mode. And I think maybe I went, I was going to say I went too strong with the radial blur, but I like it. Let's just go to the defocus node and we'll amp up the highlights in the defocused part of the image so I get more of those bokeh balls in the image. And while that isn't exactly like swirly bokeh from a vintage lens, I think it's a pretty cool start for not actually having shot with a vintage lens. So I got one more example to show you. This shot here. It's time for some more anamorphic lens flare. I could, in the color page, I could add the lens blur effect up here, and I could use the tracking controls in the color page. You can switch to the OpenFX tracker tab, and I could use that to track the anamorphic lens flare onto this torch. But why do that in the color page when we've got the Fusion page? So let's jump over to the Fusion page. Now, tracking this torch as it moves backwards and forwards might be difficult because the shape of the flare changes slightly. It passes in front of objects that are in the background. So here's a really cool trick to make it easier to track this. I'm going to add a Luma keyer, and I'm going to feed the image into it. Let's equip it in the left-hand viewer. I did that by selecting the node and pushing number 1. And I can actually Luma key this image until all I see is that perfect round center of the torch. And I can do that because it's the brightest part of the image. So now, check this out. If I add a tracker to that, and we'll position the tracker on top, this thing tracks like butter. Check this out. I mean, that track is just absolutely glued to that. And I'm using the new IntelliTrack, not the old point tracker. The new IntelliTrack is fantastic for locking onto an object. It doesn't look for patterns. It just sort of, it knows what an object is and it tracks it. So now that we've done that, let's add a lens blur effect. And sorry, not lens blur, lens flare. So we'll add the lens flare effects. Oh, I don't want it attached there. Let's detach that. I want it attached down here into my main image pipeline. Let's set it to that cool 1970s sci-fi preset. And under the position controls, if I right click on position, go to connect to tracker 1, IntelliTrack 1 path, that tracker that we just created, select position, and look at that. That lens flare is just absolutely locked onto that torch. Let's head back to the color page where we have the benefit of seeing it with my color grade. So, man, that's it. That's all the examples. Just a quick recap in like the 30 seconds that we've got left. Recreating this vintage aesthetic. A couple of important steps. We needed to understand what made those looks look like they did. Be able to work out the ingredients that were used, or the ingredients that were part of that look. The distortion, the way that out of focus highlights blur, the focus fall offs at the tops and the bottom, how the distortion looked. And almost like we made a shopping list, and then we got our shots and we went through and we added those characteristics one by one to the image. And within reason, it was pretty easy for us to consistently apply them across a series of images. A little caveat on that, though. It's not always possible to completely change an image in post, right? Sometimes you're stuck with what's been burnt into the image when it's shot. So maybe you might want to shoot with this look in mind, compose a certain way, shoot wider than you need so that once you've added that distortion, you've got plenty of room. And after all, this is why they have VFX supervisors on set, to make sure that the material that's captured can be used in post the way that they want it to use. So, hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us and listen to me talk about vintage lenses.
Yeah, man, that was amazing. What great tools. And I can't believe how good the final image looked. I mean, especially compared to that real anamorphic lens. That was really great, man. Way to go.
Yeah. I mean, hey, all kudos to Resolve. I just used the tools. Someone put them there in the first place.
Yeah, Yeah, well, that's pretty cool, and that's neat that you can kind of do a lot of that in the color page. You know, you don't have to necessarily jump into Fusion a lot. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, we have a few questions. Let's do it. All right, what is your favorite lens aesthetic or favorite lens to emulate?
Oh, that's a good question. I love them all because it's fun to get to talk about the history, and we can sort of swing to extremes, and like everything has to be vintage, but like there's a time for stuff to be clean. There's a time for it to be vintage. It's fun because I've got some anamorphic lenses, and they are like sometimes a genuine challenge to shoot with because you want to put someone over in the corner and you can't, and they sort of constrain the way that you have to shoot.
Yeah.
But I mean, of all of the looks, Cinemascope is the one that sort of stands out. It's got the most character of any look I think that you can apply to an image.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, next question. Why did you choose the color page for this kind of image manipulation and not the Fusion page? Is this a preference, or those tools behave differently depending on what page you're working on?
That's a great question. So my mantra is always use the simplest tool possible before you escalate to the more complex tool.
Can you talk a little closer to the mic, please?
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
It's
Sorry
okay.
about that. Yeah, so like my mantra is always use the simplest tool possible before you escalate to the more complex tool. So you can do some of these things in Fusion. If I can do them in color page, I get all of the benefits of being able to easily copy effects from one node to the other. There were things that we did like that lens reflection effect that we put on the shot with the candles. Because it was kind of hard with the lens reflection tools, getting the candle light sources to sort of be a point light source to drive that lens reflection. That would have been a great opportunity to use Fusion and the color page.
Yeah.
Because I could have keyed the candles, sent that to a separate media out node, and then plumbed that into my lens reflection node. So yeah, I can do it in Fusion. I can do it in color. Color has a lot of benefits of being able to copy it from one node to the other. And I'm trying to repeat this across a lot of other shots. Could I do a better job in Fusion? Hands down, yes. But you might have 50 shots that you need to complete in a video.
Yeah, exactly. All right. About the aspect ratios, can we make like a reverse letterbox, like a column box thing with that same effect?
Yeah, and you know what? If I put a little bit more effort into that, we could script that slider so that if you slide below the aspect ratio of the timeline that you're working in, that it starts to pillar box it instead.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably something that we'll try and do for a future video, and we'll make that effect available for everyone to download. But yeah, for sure, you could absolutely do that.
Great. Okay. Where would this process fall in your workflow, before or after color correction and VFX?
That's a good question. So kind of in the workflow that I had there, I was popping the lens aesthetic that I was building after any primary corrections that I'd made to the image. And the reason is because things like lens reflections inherit the color of their source in the image. So you use some anamorphic lenses, and if you shine a red light in it, you'll get a red flare. So that needs to happen after you've set the color that you want in the image. And because these looks are destructive to the image, generally in any color grading workflow, you put your looks at the end, because if I'm adding grain and mashing up colors and distorting things, if I try to do my color grading after that and I wanted to pull a key or magic mask something, it's going to make it more difficult for that tool to work. So that's why they're kind of coming at the end of the pipeline.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Yeah, I mean, even though it's not necessarily realistic to do that, because I mean, if you did shoot on a lens that has all these distortions and everything, you would have to deal with that. But I mean, then you're going through all of the hoops of, reversing the distortion and, doing noise removal and all of that kind of thing, just to get a clean image to put that stuff back on. So you might as well skip that part, since you have the opportunity to put it on afterwards, since you're doing it in post.
Yeah.
All right. Wouldn't you want to add the flare before the distortion to distort the flares as well?
So that's a good question. Do you know what I'd have to do? Is I'd actually have to go look at some anamorphic footage, because it
Mm,
depends on where the flare happens in the optical path of whether
yeah.
it inherits the distortion. And there are some lenses that have their anamorphic blocks at the front. There are lenses that have their anamorphic blocks at the back. So yes, if you was trying to emulate flare that was affected by the distortion of the lens, then yes, you'd want to put it in a different part of the image.
Yeah. Interesting. I never thought about that. All right. If you've got a shot where the talent is moving, is tracking best to keep them in focus and not walk into the effects?
Good question. So if I'm understanding this correctly, this is one of the reasons why I liked using depth map rather than magic mask to isolate the foreground. First
Mm,
of all, because it gave me all of the shades of out of focus, in between the background and the foreground. But the cool thing is that if I was to use magic mask, every time I apply that grade to another node, guess what I've got to do? Retrack the magic mask.
yeah.
But
Yep.
depth map just sits there and does its thing in the background. And you
Mm,
might have noticed as well that I always connected the depth map to my image input. So I've got node caching turned on. And that means if I change any of my primary corrections or anything downstream, I don't have to recache depth map, because it's not upstream of those changes that have been made.
yeah.
So yeah.
That's really smart. Love that. Yep. Let's do one more. Do you get access to lens grids and technical information of vintage lenses to recreate them identically and scientifically?
Oh, I wish this was that precise.
Yeah.
This was this was just me on the distortion slider going, yeah, that looks
Yeah,
good. That
looks
looks
pretty
good.
good.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this was 100% winging it. I guess if we were working in a world where when proper VFX gets done, and I say proper VFX by someone who's not me,
Hmm.
but they're compositing it, like Star Wars, the new films, all of these digital effects, and they're probably shot an anamorphic C-series lens from Panavision. They have to apply the distortion and those vintage characteristics to the CG to composite it back with the image.
Yeah.
They're not winging it. I was winging it. They would have done it scientifically.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those classic things of like, yes, it's better to do that. Can you get away with it doing it this way on a lot of projects? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Leon, this has been great, man. Thank you so much. What a great presentation, and what a awesome set of tools that we have to give some character to our lenses. That's pretty neat.
Thank you so much. And hey, awesome job with ResolveCon. This is fantastic.
Hey, thanks, man. Appreciate it. All right, we'll let you go, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys, give it up for Leon. Man, guys, if you haven't checked out Team2Films, they are on YouTube and they make really, really great videos. Really great. And yeah, can't say enough good things about them. Definitely make sure to check them out. They also have a course about switching to Resolve from other apps that shall not be named. Um,